Getting started with our conservation webinar today, I'm Holly Kirkendall, National Technology Specialist for NRCS's East National Technology Support Center. I'm pleased to turn the webinar over to our moderator and co-presenter, Dr. Glenn Carpenter. Glenn is the NRCS Animal Husbandry Leader and is headquartered in Washington, D.C. Glenn, you may now begin.
Thanks, Holly. I got to figure out how to get to the first slide. There we go. I appreciate everybody taking time out to join in today. We had an outbreak of avian influenza last spring, and we expect it back again this fall and winter. And we thought it would be timely to address biosecurity issues for NRCS. We also have a new conservation practice on emergency mortality handling that Cherie LaFleur from the Fort Worth Technology Center will address. And then Lori Miller, who's head of emergency management for Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, part of USDA, agreed to talk about avian influenza last spring and what we expect for this coming year. But I'm going to start out with biosecurity, and then we'll move on. Avian influenza is kind of hit us by surprise last year. It started out in the West in California in December, and then really concentrated on the western and central migratory flyways. 21 states were impacted, and about 50 million birds. That's an awful lot of birds. It really hit a couple states very, very hard: Minnesota, particularly with turkeys, and Iowa, particularly with laying hens. There's a lot of ways that the disease is transmitted or can be transmitted, but poor biosecurity is a major means of transmission, and one that we need to make sure that NRCS doesn't contribute to. Biosecurity is a series of practices that minimize the transfer of contamination or diseases. You're biosecure if things are in place, if practices are in place that will minimize the transfer of disease. It includes such things as isolation. If nobody's coming on your operation or you're not taking diseases anywhere, transmitting viruses, then it's isolation, and you're probably doing a good job of biosecurity. Disinfection is cleaning up and killing the viruses with disinfectants. An important part of biosecurity is registering contacts with outsiders to make sure that people know that you're going to come on farm, and make sure that they know that you're going to be there to do work. There was an interesting study that was done by poultry extension people at University of Georgia probably about 10 years ago, where they put cameras inside poultry houses and left them there for like a week, and then went back and asked the farmers if they knew who had come inside the poultry houses during that week's period of time, and the farmers made a list of who had come inside the poultry houses. Then they went back and looked at the films, and they found out that the FedEx man and the postman and the guy delivering the propane and the guy delivering the feed and a half dozen other people, all sorts of other people had come in the houses, and nobody knew anything about it. So it's important to, with the transfer of disease, to make sure that things are locked down and that there's not a lot of people coming and going that farmers don't know about. Good biosecurity can minimize problems with disease and post-slaughter contamination. We don't often think about the post-slaughter contamination, but if we bring diseases on a farm or bring microorganisms on a farm that can actually stay on the carcass of the animal, it can cause contamination later in the slaughtering process. So we want to minimize all problems with diseases on a farm. Poor biosecurity can harm the profitability of the livestock industry and the public perception of the safety of food produced by the industry. There were a lot of questions last spring about what was happening with all the turkeys and all the eggs that were coming out of these operations that were infected with avian influenza. So that's perception of the safety of the food produced by the industry, by the public. But the profitability of the livestock industry is impacted also. I believe I read that in Minnesota that was very hard hit with the turkey industry, that it was somewhere around $1 billion that it affected the industry. In Iowa, where the layer industry was impacted very greatly, I assume that it was way more than $1 billion. So it's really affects the profitability of the animal industries if there's a disease incident. Nationally, good biosecurity helps safeguard the food supply. It's really a part of national security, the fact that the food supply is safeguarded, and it's very important to everybody. Avian influenza isn't the only disease that we need to be concerned with. Other diseases, anthrax, ped virus in swine, Johne's in dairy, foot and mouth, exotic Newcastle in poultry, all those diseases and many, many more can be controlled by, or we can help control them through good biosecurity practices. NRCS needs to exhibit leadership and develop partnerships to assist in containing animal diseases. We need to partner with APHIS, with FSA, with Extension, with industry, and with the farmers. Between all of us working together, we can control diseases and make sure that farmers produce food and fiber for the citizens. One of the advantages that NRCS has is that we have an office in nearly every county in the country, and it gives us tremendous grassroots advantage. People come into our offices to ask questions. People come into our offices for advice and for assistance, and we can help smooth the way for agencies like APHIS that may not have operations in every county and may not be as familiar with the grassroots level of production. Biosecurity goals include not spreading disease, but very importantly, they include the health and safety of the employee. Even though this avian influenza didn't affect humans, there's a possibility at some point in time that it could mutate into a form that would, and then the health and safety of the employee becomes important. NRCS wants to make sure that as employees carry out their normal jobs, they don't become the source of the problem. And that's very, very important that we do that. Biosecurity policy is in the general manual at Part 130, Part 403, Subpart H. It takes a few minutes to read it. It's about 3 pages. I'd suggest that everybody read it and become familiar with it. It takes longer to become familiar with it than it does to read. So read it and think about it and learn what it's all about. For livestock, there are 3 levels of biosecurity based on the level of the interaction with the producer, facilities, and livestock. Level 1 is office or home visits. If you're just visiting the office or the home of the producer, then biosecurity really becomes a matter of washing hands and being aware of where you've been and what you've been in contact with. Level 2 is minimal contact with animals, buildings, and manure. If you have to walk through the barnyard on your way to a field that you're going to, then you're probably going to use use biosecurity level 2, which means that you put on boots and things like that. And then level 3 is close contact with animals, buildings, and manure. During the outbreak of disease, NRCS employees can't enter or shouldn't enter affected areas except at the request of APHIS or the state veterinarian. We take secondary position to APHIS when it comes to diseases, and APHIS calls the shots. But we can provide technical assistance to APHIS in finding soil for burial and providing technical assistance for composting. Pre-plan your visits, call ahead, let people know that you're coming, find out whether you really can go, because the farmer might not want you to come. Know what supplies you need, boots, coveralls, disinfectant, know what equipment's in your vehicle, know where you've been, know where you're going, because all those things are important to good security, biosecurity. Learn and adhere to biosecurity protocols. Time your visits so that you don't go to more than one poultry farm in a day. Wash your equipment and vehicle in between. Know what your personal protective equipment is. Know how to use it. Know about disposal of equipment. Know about the importance of other birds, because here in Beltsville, Maryland, where my office is, we have a tremendous problem in the parking lot with geese, and sometimes you have to watch to make sure you don't slip when you walk into the building. So it's important to know whether you've been in contact with other birds, because any birds can in their manure, in their feces, can transmit the virus for the avian influenza. There were a lot of questions last spring about whether we ought to stop all visits, whether everybody ought to pull in their horns and stay in their office. You kind of gotta take the lead from APHIS and from the state veterinarian, from the producer, and from the industry. Since the industry in the poultry industry is so concentrated into contract production, if the companies like Tyson and some of the others say that they don't want you on poultry farms, you probably shouldn't go. Areas with heavy poultry populations will be impacted. We know that. In many states, though, poultry are in pockets. If you look at West Virginia, for instance, all the poultry, or essentially all the poultry in the state's in about 4 counties, and there isn't too much poultry in the rest of the state. If you look at Michigan, about half the poultry is in Ionia County, and there's no poultry in Iola County, so you don't have to worry too much when you get away from Ionia County. In any case, it's a decision for the state conservationist, and the state conservationist will make the call as to really what you do as far as curtailing your visits to farms. That's all that I'm going to talk about. We'll pass it on to Cherie. That's my contact information. Don't hesitate to call if you have questions or need more information. Cherie?
Thank you, Glenn. Okay, so today I'm going to spend some time introducing the new conservation practice standard for emergency animal mortality management. So first we'll start off with the definition. It's a means or method for the management of animal carcasses from catastrophic mortality events. Some of the purposes: reduce impacts to surface and groundwater resources. We want to reduce the impact from odors, and also, and most definitely, decrease the spread of pathogens. So some conditions where the practice applies. It's going to apply to animal operations where a catastrophic event results in the need to manage a large number of animal carcasses. It may not apply to catastrophic mortality resulting from disease. As Glenn has mentioned, APHIS would take the lead role in managing mortality management and disposal from diseases. And it does not apply to routine animal mortality. For your routine mortality, you're going to use or continue to use Code 316 Animal Mortality Facility. So what are some of the criteria? For all the purposes, first and foremost, we need to follow all applicable federal, state, and local regulations. As with many of our other environmental engineering-related practices, you need to divert the runoff from your 25-year, 24-hour rainfall event. We don't want to cause any ponding in the area that you're managing your mortality. You need to certainly address the safety of humans as well as the livestock. Biosecurity concerns are important and need to be addressed and adhered to in all aspects of the process. You definitely want to locate all of your buried utilities in the project area. If you're conducting burial or composting or some other practice where you could get some seepage or leachate into the subsurface, you would need to destroy any drainage tile or other types of drainage measures that are in that area. And then you would need to include provisions for closing or removing your temporary components, depending upon what the management option that's chosen. So let's talk about on-site disposal. Location of the operations would definitely be important to to address. You want to take care so that you're locating it where your prevailing winds and landscape elements can minimize the impacts from odors and protect the visual resources of your neighbors and people traveling on public highways in the area. You want to locate a down gradient from springs or wells to do as much as you can to protect and prevent groundwater contamination. You definitely want to locate it above the 100-year floodplain elevation. As we've seen here in the last few days, South Carolina has been hit with a tremendous amount of rainfall, and I think I heard last night that they're calling it a 1,000-year event. There's probably some places that have flooded here in the last few days that have never flooded before. So as a minimum, you want to stay above that 100-year floodplain. And if there are no on-site suitable locations, then unfortunately you would have to look at off-site disposal. That is just something that would need to be considered. More criteria to consider when you're looking for a location. There may be a situation where there are still some unformed animal growing operations going on. So you want to minimize the disruption to those continuing operations. So you would want to locate your disposal management operations in a different location that doesn't interfere with the travel patterns of the farm equipment or the livestock. You would need to consider the soils. You want to make sure that you're operating on suitable soils. You want to try and maintain at least a minimum of 2 feet between the bottom of the facility and the seasonal high water table. And then once the mortality management operations are completed, you would need to revegetate those disturbed areas. So we've already talked a little bit about the soil. You would want to make sure that the soils that you're performing your operations on are suitable for whatever option you chose, and the web soil survey can provide a preliminary assessment of whether or not those soils are suitable for those operations. So what are some on-site disposal options? We've got a burial, composting. We could bring in incinerators or gasifiers. Open air burning might be a possibility. And then temporary storage in refrigeration or freezer units is also an option. Disposing a large number of animals can take a long time. And so storing of those carcasses may be something that's necessary. So let's talk a little bit about burial. Main thing you need to start off with is following your state and local regulations. There may be laws or regulations in place that prevent or have restrictions or criteria on the burial. So you need to be familiar with what those regulations are. Depending upon the suitability of the site that you've chosen, you may need to use multiple trenches. You may not be able to have just one large trench. So where permitted, where the regulations allow, you would want to just loosely cover your carcasses. You don't want to compact the soil over it. You would need to retain your topsoil to regrade the site as settling occurs. And then, as I've mentioned before, you would need to render inoperable any and all field drainage tile in the area, because you don't want to create that direct route to surface water. So let's talk a little bit more about burial, since burial is sort of the main activity that NRCS would be involved with for this AI situation. I know that some states are receiving requests from producers to perform on-site assessments of the soil to determine whether or not it's suitable for burial. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this particular option than I will on the others. So we'll talk about soil suitability and then seepage control. So why do we need suitable soils for burial? Well, burial has a great potential to pollute the surface or groundwaters if it's not sited in the proper soils. And we want to site the burial trenches in low permeability soils. And the Web Soil Survey evaluates potential burial sites for suitable soils. There's a report called Catastrophic Mortality Large Animal Disposal Trench Criteria that is used. And it provides a general evaluation of the site, but it's not necessarily site-specific. So as we've mentioned already, it is an online tool. Anyone can use it. The general public can use it. The report for burial provides limitations on the soil for burial as well as trench construction. It does not provide criteria for the pit design itself or the construction details. And you should not select a site based solely on what the Web Soil Survey is telling you. So you need to include a site investigation to verify the assumptions about the location. You need to verify what the Web Soil Survey is telling you about that particular site. So here's a screenshot of the Web Soil Survey and what the portion of that report might look like. This rectangular area is called the area of interest. And we went into the Soil Data Explorer, clicked on the Suitabilities and Limitations for Use tab, and selected the Catastrophic Mortality Large Animal Disposal Trench report. And it provided us limitations of the soil for burial in this particular area of interest. The red colored areas would be considered very limiting for burial. In other words, these areas would not be suitable for burial. The yellow areas are considered somewhat limiting, and you would need to investigate a little bit more, perform an on-site investigation to determine whether or not these on-site soils might be suitable. Now, in the criteria that the Web Soil Survey uses, there are some criteria that can be overcome that we can engineer around. And some examples of some of those criteria is the slope. We can, install diversions to divert any runoff around the site. Depth of rock, that may or may not be a limitation that we can overcome. If the depth of rock is deep enough, perhaps we could just use a shallower trench. Or we could do a semi-above ground type of burial. Unstable excavation walls, we can just use flatter side slopes. And there could be fragments or stones in the soil which, we can still excavate through. It just may increase a level of difficulty. But these are potential things that we can work around in the construction process. So in regards to the on-site investigation, you want all your borings should be at least 2 feet below the depth of the planned bottom of the burial trench. And in some situations, in situ soils may not be acceptable for burial. And in other situations, it may be possible that you could install a liner, but timing and logistics may not allow. But it is something to consider. If the soils are not suitable, perhaps you may have time to install a liner to create a burial site. So let's talk a little bit about the burial trench, the size and capacity, some specifications on how you would construct that trench. As far as the size, you would need to take the number of birds that you have, multiply it times the weight of those birds, and then you need to convert it to a volume. And a typical conversion factor that we use is 45 pounds per cubic foot. Once again, your trench length may be limited by the soils and or the slope, so that definitely needs to be taken into consideration. You know, what direction are you going to configure your trench? How wide can you go? How long can you go? Do we need to find multiple sites on the property to construct multiple trenches? You want to cover your mortality with at least 2 feet of cover soil, and as I said before, you don't want to compact it. You want to leave it loose so that you can get, you want an aerobic type of situation to happen for the decomposition. You don't want it to go anaerobic. And a shallower trench in warm soils, warm, dry soils, are going to promote the decomposition process better than deep, cold, wet trenches. And then you want to provide, you know, you want to mound your cover soil over your burial area to divert the runoff, and then also to accommodate the settling that's going to occur as the carcasses decompose. So how would we construct that trench? Well, you want your trench bottom to be level. You don't want the leachate that's produced as the decomposition takes place to pool in one area of the trench. You would like it to be spread out, so you want to construct a level bottom. You need to follow your OSHA regulations, especially if you're going greater than 5 feet. Then you need to really start looking at the soil types that you have and whether or not you need to bench it or slope it. You want to stockpile your excavated spoil at least 2 feet away from the top edge of the trench. And you want to separate your trenches. If you have your trenches side by side, you want to separate them by a minimum of 3 feet. 4 feet would be preferable of undisturbed area. And then you want to stockpile your topsoil in a different location to have on hand to grade the site after the ground has settled. Whenever you cover the carcasses, you want to cover with 2 to 3 feet of loose soil. Typically, you're going to look at a flatter slope of, say 3 to 1 to allow for vegetation growth, as well as being able to manage and perform the O&M of that site. And here in this instance of poultry, you would have a layer, a 1 foot thick layer of birds on the bottom. Then you would come with another 1 foot layer of soil, and then another layer of birds. In this situation, we're assuming the trench is 4 feet deep, and then we would come with our 3 feet of cover soil on top. Some other things to consider for design and loading design and safety. Safety needs to be the the number one factor in these operations. So you would need to use barriers where applicable to manage the traffic flow and to keep vehicles and equipment at least 4 feet away from the top edge of the trench. And as I mentioned before, you need to make sure that your excavation techniques are OSHA compliant. So the next on-farm disposal option we'll talk about is composting. the NRCS National Engineering Handbook, Part 637, and then Part 651. Both have information on composting and mortality management. You want to plan for the amount of carbon material that you need. In the HPAI event in Iowa, one of the subject matter experts shared with me that for a 400-foot poultry house, he was using anywhere from 2 to 4 semi-truckloads of carbon material. And so it takes a lot of material to compost, but composting is a very effective option. You will definitely want to protect the compost pile from precipitation and runoff if you're constructing your windrows outside. And you want to cover your piles with a minimum of 18 inches of carbon material to discourage pests and minimize odors. A couple of other options are incinerators and gasifiers. You would need to use a Type 4 incinerator that's suitable for human and animal remains. Then they have to be approved for use within the state. Your state may or may not approve the use of this type of equipment, so that is something that you would need to research and verify. You would want to base the minimum capacity on the average weight of animals times the number of animals in the event. This may be a situation where you cannot get a piece of equipment large enough to dispose of your carcasses all at one time. This may be a time when you need to consider the on-form refrigeration in order to meter the operation and dispose of the carcasses. And these two pieces of equipment, they can produce a lot of heat, and you need to locate them a minimum of 20 feet away from any structures. And then the ash could be spread according to Code 590 nutrient management once it's done. Open air burning would be another option, and it's basically, it's building a large bonfire and or perhaps air curtain to structures, which is be a little bit more easier to manage than just a bonfire type of situation. But not every state or county is going to allow this. It's typically strictly prohibited. You typically would need to have permits, and so this may be an option, but it's just one of those options that you need to look into and see if it might be feasible for your area. And we've already talked about the refrigeration units in order to manage and help with the logistics of disposing of a large amount of mortality. It could be possible that multiple units would be needed. You would need to account for the type of equipment that you're going to use to empty the refrigeration unit. You definitely would want it to be durable and leak-proof for the time of that it's going to take to complete your disposal operations. You would need to consider where you're going to place it, because you're going to have equipment coming and going to load and unload the units. So the area where it's placed needs to be able to handle that load and traffic. For rendering, the recommended temperatures would be 22 to 26 degrees. But for composting, you want to keep it a little bit above freezing. If you freeze the birds, it's going to take longer to compost them, because they'll have to defrost before they're able to heat up for the composting process. We also have some information in the practice standard for off-site disposal. The three topics that we cover are transportation, rendering, and landfilling. And I'm just going to briefly touch on these for transportation. If you do happen to use an option that is off-form, you definitely want those, whether they're roll-off beds or dumpsters or dump trucks. They definitely need to be leak-proof, tarped, and covered. You don't want a trail of leachate following you down the highway. So for rendering, renderers are getting to be fewer and fewer in numbers, so it may or may not be a viable option in your area. And depending upon what the reason is for the mortality, it may be difficult to transport the carcasses to the renderer. There may be travel restrictions, and logistics may limit it. So it's a potential option that would definitely need to be looked into in more detail. The same goes for a landfill. If you can use a landfill, it needs to be a Subtitle D landfill. These landfills have the proper drainage and leachate collection systems to be able to handle animal mortality. And typically, the individual landfill is going to decide whether or not they can accept the mortality. So it may or may not be an option in your area, but it's something that would need to be investigated. So what are some considerations that you can take into account when planning for emergency mortality disposal? What is available for equipment and land application in the area? What are the management capabilities of the operator? What is the emotional impact on the producer caused by the losses? What degree of pollution control is required by the state and local agencies? How is it going to affect the wildlife and domestic animals? What are the economics of the available alternatives? That's going to vary from area to area depending upon what types of options you have in your area. And then the effect on your neighbors. The aesthetics of the operation, the odors, traffic on public roads. These are all things that need to be considered when planning for emergency disposal. Some other considerations and something to look into. If you already have a CNMP, the Farmstead Safety and Security element may have already planned for catastrophic mortality. An on-form burial site, if it's the soils are suitable, may have already been identified. And once again, the initial planning of the site should include referring to the web soil survey. You may want to consider alternatives to prevent bloating, such as opening abdominal cavities, and this would be especially true for your larger animals. Are there state requirements for record keeping? You may need to record with the property deed at the courthouse the location of the burial site. You may need to keep as a record the type and quantity of mortality, the burial date, and there may be other details that are required by local regulations. So for plans and specifications, there are a number of items that need to be looked at. I think first and foremost is your contact information for state authorities. Anytime you have a catastrophic event, you need to notify your local folks, and that would typically start with contacting the state or the local vet who handles that form. And then from there are going to be procedures for notifying other folks. You would probably want to plan, if you're planning this prior to an incident happening, you would want to plan for a worst case scenario. So you would want to consider all of the animals that are on that form. You would want to lay out the location of where those mortality management activities are going to take place. You would need to take into account the grading plan for your drainage features. What do our soils look like? If we are able to do on-site disposal, what are those requirements? Are there any structural details we need to include? Vegetative requirements, odor management, and contact information for those off-site facilities if that is an option. So then we would also need to address the O&M. What are those, specific instructions for each component, whether it's composting or burial, or you have some sort of mechanical option that you've chosen. What are those specific instructions for making that particular option work properly? What are safety and biosecurity considerations? You would want your contact and phone numbers of people to contact for losses, and I have a sample plan that I'll show you here on the next slide. You need to maintain your record keeping. What are the methods and procedures for disposal that you're going to employ? And then you need to make sure that you perform your periodic inspections of your on-site disposal sites. Definitely repair and replace damaged components as necessary. Here is a little emergency mortality response plan that I put together. It's just a suggestion, but it includes the date, the form name, the physical address, directions to the facility, emergency contacts, your state animal health agency folks, your contractors that you need to contact. Having all of this information in one location could be very helpful in an event that you need to respond quickly. So we have some additional O&M for mechanical types of equipment. You want to inspect them on a regular basis during an operation to make sure that they're operating as efficiently as possible. You want to run them according to the manufacturer's recommendations, and inspect periodically to make sure that everything is working properly. For composting, you're going to need to identify the equipment and the amount of carbon material that you need, and you want to locate that as soon as possible. It would be helpful to have a recipe and sort of make it a cookbook process, and then you need to have thermometers to monitor those temperatures to make sure that you're composting properly. So here are some more references that are available for folks who want to learn more about the various disposal methods. I highly recommend this publication here that was put together by Kansas State University. Carcass Disposal, a comprehensive review, and it truly is a comprehensive review. It goes into depth into many of the disposal options that I've mentioned here today, and I think it's a great resource of information. So I also want to touch on NRCS assistance. As we've mentioned before, APHIS provides the financial assistance in the case of the disease, and Laurie will touch on that a little bit more. Now, in regards to NRCS assistance, we can definitely provide technical assistance. We can provide assistance with planning for emergency disposal due to a catastrophic event. We can perform the on-site assessment of the soils for siting the various disposal options, and we can report that technical assistance under Code 368. In regards to financial assistance, most likely would be a situation where USDA declares an emergency. Two recent examples include the cattle deaths that we experienced in the Upper Plains in the fall of 2013 due to the early blizzard, and then some livestock losses in Nebraska in the summer of 2014 from some tornadoes. These two incidents led to rules waivers which allowed EQIP assistance in a short time frame. There are no EQIP rules on the books per se, with a documented process at this point. It's something that's going to be developed at the time of a situation and the need arises. So with that, we can answer some questions. I don't know, Glenn, if you want to take questions now or if you want to wait until the end, but I'll turn it back over to you, Glenn.
Thanks, Cherie. Let's go ahead and wait till the end. I think we need to do that. And let's go on with Lori.
Thank you so much, Glenn, Cherie, Holly, and everybody. My name is Lori Miller. I'm an environmental engineer with USDA APHIS Veterinary Services in Riverdale, Maryland. And my role here since 2008 has been to focus on animal disease outbreak response, given that APHIS is the lead federal responder in that case. And specifically, I focus on decon and disposal issues. So in the last several years, I've worked with a number of interagency groups, and in particular, there was a White House subcommittee on foreign animal disease threats that convened a working group in 2007, and they asked us to identify where were our decon and disposal challenges and what research and development projects could be implemented to help fill those gaps. And so that's been much of my work over the past 7 or 8 years has been managing these various projects with a number of performers. And so given that APHIS is the lead federal response agency, this is kind of a summary, which it may be difficult to read, but it is on the APHIS website. I'm talking about how our response happens. So you have a producer who has a flock of birds. They notice an increased mortality in their flock, and they report it to their local veterinarian or their state veterinarian. If the veterinarian believes that it's likely to be a reportable disease, such as high path AI, then they will take samples. They'll call in their federal counterpart at APHIS, and those samples will be rushed off to the national lab for analysis. Sometimes they're also, they split those samples with the state lab. Within 24 hours, they'll know if it's a high path, so an H5 or an H, type of virus, and then it takes another 24 hours before they know if it's the H5N2 or what have you. So once that farm is confirmed positive, it's quarantined, and APHIS then sends out a caseworker to count the number of birds, appraise their value, and provide an indemnity. So we pay the producer or the grower for the birds that they have at their market value. At that point in time, some of the birds may have died. If needed, we will send in crews to euthanize the remainder of the flock, and then the disposal process begins. So APHIS pays for pretty much the entire process, from the identification, the lab work, the indemnity for the market value of the animals, the depopulation, disposal, cleaning and disinfection, and the follow-up testing. That is all covered through APHIS. So in January 23rd, 2015, we had a certain amount of information about disposal. So there were a certain number of disposal options that we were aware of. We had been doing these research projects over the past several years. We had spent a lot of time developing tools to make it easier for the responder to decide which disposal option would work best for their site, given the current weather conditions, the time of year, the availability of resources, and so forth. And as you may have noticed from Cherie's presentation, there are quite a number of factors that go into deciding what is the best option. And so what I'm going to do first is go through the options, tell you, kind of describe them, tell you how we use them this spring, talk to you about why we prefer some options over others, and then spend a little time telling you how it played out in the spring during our response. So let's start with composting. As Cherie mentioned, in the case of an animal disease outbreak, quarantine is an important part of that. And so it is important to restrict movement of infected materials. Therefore, if at all possible, the policy of APHIS in collaboration with the state decision makers is usually to try to keep those infected materials on the infected premises and not transport them anywhere. But sometimes that's not possible, in which case a safe transport method would be required to an appropriate disposal location. So in terms of composting, this was a great option for us in this spring, because in most cases we had either turkey flocks that were infected, in which case those birds were in large barns. They were often floor raised, so they were on a bed of bedding, and there was a lot of space in the barns so that we could do indoor composting. Some of the other farms that became infected were egg-laying facilities, and most of those involved a large number of birds in cages with narrow walkways between the stacks of cages. And so there was not a lot of open space in those barns, therefore indoor composting was not possible. But I'll add a little more detail to that later. So in-house composting was used extensively this spring, and it involved, in the upper left-hand picture there, placing a layer, about a 1-foot layer of a carbon material such as wood chips, wood shavings, corn stover, sunflower seed hulls, oat hulls, down the middle of the barn, then placing the infected birds with the infected litter onto that base layer, and then capping the entire mound with another foot of carbon material. And it performed very well. We required that there be a mortality composting subject matter expert available to guide the building of the piles, because we found that if we didn't have an expert guiding the construction, the piles did not perform, the virus, they didn't reach temperature, the virus was not necessarily inactivated, and oftentimes there were a lot of vectors such as flies attracted to the improperly constructed piles. So one of the main lessons we learned from this spring was there's a certain number of requirements you have to have for effective composting. You have to have a subject matter expert to help guide the windrow construction. You have to have sufficient carbon source to balance the nitrogen to get the microbes to do their job. You need enough space to build the windrows, and they have to have the proper balance of moisture and aeration to function. And in this slide, there's some other examples of composting. To the right is composting in an ag bag type unit that was not used extensively in the spring because we didn't have any data about how well those bags performed in terms of bringing the entire biomass up to the required temperature for an extended period of time. We do have a composting protocol that's posted on the APHIS website. It was developed by the composting technical team, which consisted of about 20 mortality composting subject matter experts throughout North America, and that was just published a week ago Friday. And then at the bottom there you see some outdoor windrows. We did use outdoor composting in some cases, although we preferred indoor whenever possible. Another on-site option was burial. These are some photographs of the upper left is from the UK in 2001 with their FMD outbreak. The one on the lower right is from Japan's FMD outbreak in 2010. Upper left was not lined. The lower right, they attempted to line it with these blue tarps, but as you can imagine, that would be fairly ineffective. You wouldn't dig a hole and line it with blue tarps and fill it with water and expect the water to stay in there if you were going to build a swimming pool. Well, it doesn't work for containing leachate either. On-site incineration was another approach that we used. The top two photographs are air curtain burners in trenches. We did not use the trench method this spring. Based on experience we had with a low-path avian influenza outbreak in Virginia several years ago, that was found to be relatively inefficient, and there was a preference for the fireboxes. So the bottom two pictures show air curtain incinerators in the boxes. We did use those. They had limited throughput of about 5 tons per day, and we were generating anywhere from 120 to 240 tons per day from a single egg layer facility, and we had numerous of them infected simultaneously. Just going back to burial for a moment, although burial is often the first option that folks think of when they think about disposing of animal carcasses, it's fine if you have the right conditions and a small number of animals, but when we're talking about the massive quantities that we saw with the outbreak this spring, and even more massive would be if we had some sort of outbreak with large animals, it can be a significant environmental threat. And so this graphic shows a burial pit. A study from the University of Saskatchewan found that the leachate that comes from a burial site contains about 12,000 parts per million of ammonium nitrogen and about 1,500 parts per million phosphorus. Comparing that with the EPA drinking water standards of 10 parts per million nitrate, 1 part per million nitrite, and 1 part per million phosphorus, you can see that those levels are anywhere from 10,000 to 1,000 times higher than the drinking water standards. And so that's an issue because that's the concentration coming out of the bottom of the burial pit. Depending on the distance to the water table, that concentration may reduce some, and then it can migrate to the water table and then flow to nearby drinking water wells or wells that are used to water livestock. 100 feet is the distance from a burial pit to a drinking water well that's required in some states. Other states are up to 600 feet distance. It just varies by state. We currently do not have any data about, what would the concentration of nitrogen or phosphorus be at the well, because it would depend on so many factors. It's really site-specific. We had initiated a project to evaluate that, but that has not been funded at this point. So we hope to get some more data on that in the future. And then looking at sort of a plan view of this, where you have your burial pit, the leachate flowing down gradient to a drinking water well. And it's important because the nitrates in particular can be fatal to infants. And, so if you're over 10 parts per million of nitrate at that well, and you're starting at 12,000, and and it can be fatal, and that's a pretty big risk. And since we don't have data, I would certainly advise being conservative and avoiding this risk at all, if at all possible. Nitrogen, once it reaches the water table or can discharge to surface waters where it's toxic to aquatic life, depletes dissolved oxygen in receiving waters, so reduces the number of fish and other invertebrates, and then also eutrophies the waterways. Another option is landfill, and we did use it during the springtime for some of the large egg layer facilities where we couldn't do indoor composting because there was no space. The farms didn't have a lot of land around the barns, so there was no space to do the composting. Their soils were not suitable, and the water table was too high to do on-site burial. The incinerators, as I said, that were capable of being brought on site were, the capacity just wasn't enough to make it worthwhile, and so the materials had to be transported off-site. What we used were a sort of zip bag, a bio-zip bag that is placed in the truck. I don't really have a good picture of a bio-zip bag, but it would be placed into the roll-off container. The sides the top would drape over the sides. You would put down some carbon, like wood chips in the bottom. You would load it with the birds. You would then fold the sides of this bag up and zip it shut, and then cover it with a tarp and disinfect the entire thing before it moved down the road. And then once it arrived at the landfill, it would be tipped out. This doesn't quite show the protocol that we used. What we developed with the state of Iowa was that the landfill would have a trench prepared so that when so they would dig a trench in the waste, the load of birds would come dump into the trench, and then they would immediately cover that bag over with additional waste so that no birds would come in contact with that. And one of the reasons we like landfills over the unlined burial is because they basically address all the environmental concerns. So with unlined burial, you have the concerns of leachate reaching groundwater. You have methane gas that's generated from the anaerobic decomposition, which can be explosive if it migrates to nearby buildings. And with an engineered landfill, you have a liner system that minimizes the likelihood of leachate reaching the environment. The leachate that is produced inside the liner is collected and either discharged to a pond or wetland or taken to a wastewater treatment plant, or it's recirculated and sprayed back onto the waste. Also, there are methane control systems that will collect the methane and use it sometimes as a fuel source. There are monitoring wells and groundwater interception drains underneath the liner, and then monitoring wells where they can keep track of any leakage. So if a producer wants to bury on site and they want to line the burial pit, by the time they're finished lining, maybe worrying about the leachate collection, worrying about the gas buildup and all that, they're basically building a permitted landfill on their property, which is going to affect their property values. And that raises the question, well, at that rate, why not just use existing landfills that already have all those permits and protections in place? Well, as we found out, there are a lot of reasons why. I'll get to that in a moment. Rendering was is another option for animal mortality disposal, but it was not used during the spring, and it involves the birds or the animals being collected at the farm, transported to a rendering facility, being ground into a more of a slurry where they're then cooked, and 60% of the biomass goes off as a steam or condensate portion. 20% of the biomass is a fat or tallow portion, which can be used as biodiesel, and the remaining 20% of the biomass is a meat or bone meal, which normally is used for animal feed or pet foods, but in the case of an infected batch would not go into the animal food chain. But we did not use that in the spring, and renderers are reluctant to take infected materials because they don't want their pet food brand to be tarnished with a recall or adverse publicity. Although if the outbreak was large enough and it encompassed a rendering plant that was in the quarantine zone, they would likely be willing to take the materials because they wouldn't have any other business and could be used for disposal only purposes. And then finally, we also looked at off-site incineration. We had some purpose-built incinerators. Well, they were, I should probably say purpose retrofitted incinerators that were brought to a central location near the farms in Iowa. We also looked into using fixed incineration facilities, but those facilities could only take boxes that were approximately a cubic yard, and they would only hold about 140 pounds each. And so we would have needed so many boxes for the number of birds that were being produced. It would have been exorbitantly expensive, plus the fact that the fixed incinerator that was willing to take them was on the East Coast. It was a non-starter for us. And so over the years, we've developed sort of a ranking of these major disposal options, and based on the opinion of a panel of federal subject matter experts, as well as data from the UK and a number of other sources, we have determined that considering 15 different criteria, off-site landfill is the safest, most cost-effective option, followed by rendering, followed by permitted incinerator, followed by composting and open-air burning, and that on-site burial turns out to be the least favorable option based on those 15 different criteria. And there's extensive footnotes about this table, and there's an accompanying decision loop and checklist that goes with this matrix. If anybody's interested in having it, I'm happy to provide it. So for the 2015 response, we used the order of hierarchy shown here. We used, even though those off-site options of landfill, rendering, and fixed incinerator are overall more preferable, just the concept of moving anything off-site was not considered. And because we're talking about poultry and the animals are smaller and we were able to handle many of them on-site, it was possible to start with the on-site options. And so in-house composting was preferred. If not, we went to outdoor. If not, on-site burial was considered, or bringing mobile technologies on-site. If that was not possible, then we looked to landfills, rendering, and incineration. And this is just an example of the checklist and the level of detail that it has. It goes into excruciating detail about, how to get the information about where your nearest landfills are, phone numbers and contact information. So lots of detail about how to implement those options. And that is a tool that we have available for our folks. So how that all played out this spring? Well, from this map, you can see these purple spots are the commercial premises that were infected. We started with one farm in California. A few weeks later, we had another one. A few weeks later, we had one in Arkansas, a couple in Missouri, and then Minnesota broke. And it exploded exponentially. And while it was exploding from 10 premises to 60 premises over a 2-week period, Iowa broke. And it broke with one of the egg layer facilities, which had 3.8 million birds. So we had thousands of APHIS employees deployed, thousands of contractors, state responders. The response was overwhelming, and the need was overwhelming. So the way that played out, we had 211 commercial premises. Minnesota had 109. Of those, 108 were composted. 1 was buried. Iowa used every option they had available just because of the magnitude of the birds, the number of birds at those egg-laying facilities. South Dakota used burial. Wisconsin, Nebraska, California, Missouri, and North Dakota all composted, and Arkansas had 1 site that was buried. The composting challenges, as I mentioned before, we required that the windrow construction be guided by a composting subject matter expert. And that's not just any kind of composting SME. That's someone who has extensive experience in mortality composting, preferably during a disease response. Well, there are only about 24 of those folks in North America that we were able to identify. And at the peak, we would be deploying 5 at a time. And given that any one of the individuals could only physically sustain being out for 2 weeks maximum, it was very difficult to keep up with the number of compost windrows, the amount of composting that was being done, and having the appropriate expertise. Another enormous challenge was carbon source. A ideal ratio of for compost would be 3 pounds of carbon material per pound of bird. We were using the sort of emergency ratio of half that, 1.5 pounds per pound of bird. At 50 million birds, estimated $30 million just for carbon alone. The temperatures in the windrows had to be monitored every day for 14 days. The piles turned, monitored another 14 days. Extremely labor intensive for people in personal protective equipment. And all of that movement on and off the premises was a biosecurity issue. It's hard to coordinate the multiple experts, and people just wanted the recipe. They wanted, well, just tell us how to do it, we'll do it ourselves, without understanding that the troubleshooting part was really the important thing, and you needed an expert for that. Burial challenges. States guided when burial could be used. Very few of the sites were suitable due to the soils and high water tables. Some of the stakeholders, like industry folks, thought that, why were the states not letting us bury? But they didn't understand the environmental implications. The on-site incinerators had such small capacity, they really didn't do us much good. Landfills were very concerned about receiving infected animals and producing infected leachate. It took us 42 days to work through all of the waste acceptance criteria, safety guidelines, and questions for the public before the first landfill would accept the first load. We did have a company that came forward and had a soil treatment incinerator that they retrofitted to manage the birds. At its peak, it took over a month to get that up and running, and at its peak it could only manage about 330 tons per day, which was about as much as we were producing from 1.5 farms, and we had 71 farms in Iowa. But every bit helped. And the good news was the research we had been doing over the past several years paid off. We had a risk assessment which helped guide us on how to line the trucks. We had the list of composting subject matter experts to tap into. We did have guidance documents on the APHIS website, and that all paid off. We learned some lessons. The liners didn't work when they sat in the hot sun for 42 days filled with birds. Had we been able to transport them straight away to the landfill, that wouldn't have been an issue, but that wasn't the case. And so some things that we have done is we've developed a national composting protocol that is available on our website. We've surveyed the states. We're working with them to try to line up these options in advance. And I'm just so grateful to see that NRCS has the mission area to work with farms to develop site-specific plans. I think that's exactly what's needed. And I hope that APHIS and NRCS can work together in the future to kind of, bring our heads together and get that in place. So we've made a lot of progress. The planning paid off, but we've still got a lot of challenges, and we hope we don't have any more positive premises. So thank you. Back to you, Glenn.
Thanks, Lori. I think we've got, I'm not sure how Holly wants to handle questions, and I think there are questions for a little test, a little quiz for participants at the end, so I'm not sure how Holly wants to, how we need to handle the questions on the presentations and the questions for the quiz.
Glenn, this is Holly. Y'all
Okay.
just go through the Q&A that people have typed in, and the quiz questions come after the fact once we have stopped the webinar.
Okay.
So I'll rely on you and Cherie and I guess Lori to look at the questions as they're coming in and kind of summarize some of those and answer those as you need to.
Okay. Just going down the list, first one from Joseph Spence. Interestingly enough, most county NRCS parking lots have the potential for cross-contamination through farmers' pickup trucks visiting us without being cleaned, and that's right, and that's a reason that we really want our vehicles, NRCS vehicles, to be kept clean, so that it can maybe minimize the chances of cross-contamination. Next one, John Feisner. It's important that NRCS develop new and innovative methods in order to complete practice certification. I'm not sure what this one is. This is Well, I think that we, coordination between the contractor and the producer and NRCS and other agencies is important. So we're all working on the same page, so that one state doesn't do one thing and another state do another. Particularly if practices work, there's no reason for one state to do them and the state next door not to. Okay, is there an Excel spreadsheet for properly sizing an animal mortality facility? Cherie, do you know? I don't know of one.
There is no national spreadsheet. I do know that there are many states who have developed their own, and if you, Joseph, if you would get in touch with me, I can point you in the direction of some of the states who have developed some pretty good spreadsheets.
Good. Thanks, Cherie. Frank Wu asks, is it true that the 368 standard provides criteria and guidance for the management of animal carcasses for catastrophic mortality events for things other than disease? Well, yeah, oh, okay, Cherie already answered it. Yeah, it is. Okay, maybe that's what the check means. I guess that's what the check means, that Cherie already answered it. Shannon asked, is a 1.5 to 1 slope? And that was all taken care of. Kevin Kidja asks, even in well-aerated soils, waters move through them. Most all nutrients from the carcasses will not be taken up by plants, but will go where? Well, I think you've answered part of it, or one of the things that to be concerned with is that the nutrients from the carcasses don't end up in water, and in a lined. Of course, if they end up in a lined landfill, the nutrients will stay within the lined landfill. Pete Vanderstappen asks, will NRCS or APHIS give some guidance on a good compost mix?
This is Lori. If I could answer that one, Glenn.
Okay, sure.
Thank you. So APHIS has published their composting protocol, which includes exactly those specifications as well as a number of other things. Is there a means where I can send a link to that SOP and also maybe our disposal decision tree and checklist to the group, maybe by sending it to Holly?
Why don't you just paste that right into our chat area, and I will post it into the links. Yes.
Well, I'm not. Okay, I will try to.
Or you can email it to me, or
that would probably be better.
Okay, we'll
the link wasn't
cooperating
with my computer yesterday, so I'm just afraid.
Okay.
Also, along those lines, I'm in the process of putting together information to send out to field staff and to state staff, and it should be coming out within the next couple weeks as soon as it gets finished and goes through a review process here at headquarters. So it shouldn't be too long. Hopefully, it'll be before the first incidence of avian influenza. Okay, Pete also asked, one option talked about is silage by mixing birds and other materials and putting in an ag bag. Yeah, Paul Patterson and Mike Hewlett at Penn State have been working on that, and you end up with silage that ends up being able to be kept until a renderer can take it. And I talked to Paul last week, and it was it's an interesting concept, and he felt that it was exhibiting a lot of success and that it might be a good option in the future. On the other hand, you've got to find renderers that are willing to take it. And it's not really a disposal option. It's an option for holding until it can be utilized for another product. Shannon asked, do you have any comments on use restrictions for burial sites, say 5, 10, 25 years after burial?
This is Lori. I can comment on that,
Okay.
Glenn. So Japan and South Korea both have a 3-year restriction on their burial sites where you can't disturb them for 3 years. I have communicated with both countries, and there is no data to support that length of time. There was a study in Canada that unearthed an FMD burial site from 50 years earlier, and the carcasses were still pretty much intact. So, you know, I mean, if you've buried carcasses and there's no lime, I think the case in Canada, they applied lime, which tended to preserve the carcasses, which is why they hadn't really changed. If the decomposition does occur, and I would argue that it's going to take more than 3 years, but at any rate, you're going to have some evidence that there had been a burial site there. So once a burial site, always a burial site, and constructing through those trenches later can unearth bones and other remains. Whether it's an infection risk or not is unknown. I would say, you know, the longer the time, the less likely. So in other words, we don't know.
Yeah, thanks, Lori. Okay, Scott Snyder asks, the 368 practice has 2 national payment schedules set up. How do we implement the 368 practice through NRCS financial programs? And we'll let Cherie take that.
Yeah, I think that's going to be on a, on a case-by-case basis, similar to the actions that programs took after the fall blizzard and then the tornadoes in Nebraska. Programs implemented some emergency measures, and I know that is not as timely as it needs to be, but unfortunately that's where we're at this point.
Thanks, Cherie. Okay, Helen Jones asks, when digging boring holes, what are specifics of what you look for?
Go ahead.
Lori?
You want to comment, Lori?
Well, yeah. So given the groundwater, the leachate to soil to groundwater pathway, the sort of protocol for analyzing the risk in that case is enough data to be able to predict, to model the hydraulic conductivities and the concentration, so the fate and transport over time. I come from the hazardous waste cleanup industry, and in the borings we took were split spoon samplers with to the water table with evaluations every 2 feet. And I don't know that that's necessary, but certainly below the top 6 feet, you've got plenty of data for the first 6 feet, but below that, getting some data which would tell you hydraulic conductivity and depth to groundwater, I think would enable an estimation of how quickly the contaminants would reach a drinking water well.
Okay, good, thank you. Frank Wu asked, does APHIS have a practice standard for disease events?
So we don't publish practice standards like NRCS does, and I'm envious. I wish we did because you guys do such a great job. All we have are the protocols that have been published, and so the link that I'm going to send to Cherie will have access to all of those protocols. So the restocking, which tells you, how long a compost pile has to be there, the composting SOP, which tells how the compost pile has to perform. So I hope that gives you the information.
I know APHIS has a lot of SOPs, has a lot of information, and if people want to get on the APHIS website and look around, there's just a tremendous amount of information that APHIS has really put together. A lot of it very recently because of this outbreak of avian influenza. Okay, Pete Vanderstappen asked, did anyone ever figure out what volume of leachate would you generate from a 1 foot layer of bird mortality? If the bottom was level, could this volume be treated by soil like a leach field?
Well, I can answer part of that. Yeah, I actually did some calculations. There are calcs on how much leachate is generated. I don't recall off the top of my head, but I can certainly get you that. If I recall, well, no, I'm not going to try to do it off the top of my head. I can send you that information. Regarding the volume being treated by soil like a leach field, the concentration of nutrients in carcass leachate is, I think it was 2 to 4 times the concentration of swine lagoon sludge, and it would be many, many fold more concentrated than typical septic effluent from a residence. So yes, the answer is it could be treated by soil like a leach field, but to treat it to acceptable levels, you'd need an awful lot of depth to groundwater.
Thanks, Lori. Carl Dupolt just says great presentation. That's excellent to get that feedback. Shannon Weaver asks, on-farm composting, would you comment on using a combination of in-house and outside composting to help with both biosecurity and getting producers back into production faster?
And I can do that. So we preferred that the producers kept the windrows indoors for the initial 14-day cycle. So our protocol was when the windrows were set, when they were completed, that would start the timer ticking. 14 days of temperature monitoring. Then after 14 days, the temperatures were evaluated, and if they met the criteria, then the piles could be turned. Ideally, we wanted the piles built in-house. At the 14-day mark, they could then be turned and moved outdoors because much of the virus would have been inactivated by that first 14-day heat cycle. So that was believed to be relatively low risk. So it both maintained biosecurity to the maximum extent possible, and it also shortened the timeline a little bit. Ultimately, the premises could not be released from quarantine until after the compost had gone through 2 14-day cycles. And so if you figure a couple days for turning and whatnot, a minimum of 30 days, plus the barn has to be cleaned, disinfected, and then they have to take surface samples inside the barn, send those off for PCR testing. If the PCR comes back positive with any indication of organisms, then it's sent to virus isolation, which takes 21 days. Plus, there's a 21-day required downtime after cleaning and disinfection before restocking, and that's an international requirement. So it ended up not helping that much because they were going to be down anyways. But yes, that option was there.
Good. Thanks, Lori. Julie Bradford asks, how is the composted material disposed of after composting is completed?
Great question. That was a challenge because the emergency composting the goal was to inactivate the virus. The goal was not to make marketable product, compost. So we were kind of trying to strike that balance. All APHIS would pay for was virus inactivation. So you needed a lot more carbon and a lot better carbon to make really nice compost that would be marketable. Many of the farms just held it on site until they were able to land apply within their nutrient management permits. I don't know if they were able to market any of it, and if not, then perhaps holding till the next season or landfill would be options. But for the most part, they were responsible for that disposal themselves because it was considered non-infected at that point.
Lori, this is just a thought. If people still have the compost from last year, they might actually want to hang on to it because there's still a significant amount of carbon and probably microbes in the compost that might be needed this fall if their own operations become infected again, which we hope isn't the case, but you never know.
This is true.
Okay, Alexandra Reyes asks, how would the expected outbreak for the fall be managed?
Well, hopefully better than in the spring. Given this was our first time out in a decade or more, we had a steep learning curve. So a lot of lessons learned, a great deal of effort put into learning those lessons and improving our preparedness for fall. So we've staffed up, we're reaching out to states more, so a lot more outreach. We now have the compost protocol developed. We didn't have it while we were responding in the spring. We had protocols, they just weren't agreed upon by everybody. Now we have one that's a consensus standard that everybody agrees on. So we are improving the way we manage our teams. We're trying to use state officials who know their local environmental regulations in the disposal team leader role in our management teams. We are training up more composting subject matter experts, or at least sending them to school so they can become apprentice experts. So lots more training and lots more people.
Thank you. Helen Jones asks, what would be the minimum size facility you would develop a mortality plan in advance for?
So my recommendation, it would be nice if they were all had a plan. We kind of use 100 cows as our de minimis quantity. So, and that number is arbitrary, but it's stood the test of time. 100 cows is about 50 tons of biomass, and so that's, I don't know how many, that's maybe 10,000 chickens, I guess. So that would be about the level where I would say they should start thinking about it. The thinking is that anything less than 50 tons buried in one location unlined is not going to have significant impact on the water table, even if you're not that suitable for burial. But more than that, then they really should have a plan in place.
Actually, the CNMP, the Comprehensive Nutrient Management Plan that we've dealt with within NRCS for many years, part of the CNMP has been a plan for mortality disposal. It's really been aimed at daily mortality disposal, but I think there was part of it that where there's supposed to be some consideration, at least, of what to do in an emergency situation. Helen Reyes, where is it expected? I'll just take that. I think everywhere. Right now, I think what we're gearing up for is that there's no reason for me to believe that it would not be in the Western Flyway and the Central Flyway like it was last spring, but also the Eastern Flyway that would make it a problem everywhere from Pennsylvania down through Florida and Alabama and Mississippi. So I think we're going to, it's really an important thing, and I think we're going to have big problems. So I hope not. I hope I'm wrong. Steve Henry says, how large is a typical refrigeration unit? Is it practical for catastrophic mortality?
If I could comment just briefly on that. If you can compost in-house, and so we were able to compost in-house with the turkey facilities almost universally. For the egg layer facilities, we're talking 3 to 5 million birds per premises. You'd need an awful lot of refrigeration units for that, and they would have to be disinfected inside and out. So I think that would make it a challenge. Other forms of storage, what we ended up doing at the first egg layer facility was we thought that the landfills were going to take the material right away, so we sent roll-off dumpsters, we sent a bunch of liners, and we started pulling the birds out of the houses at 200 tons a day, filling up those roll-offs, and we had hundreds of them for 42 days. They basically served as storage. They were not good storage, I'll tell you that much.
Okay, thank you. Bill Prince asks what happened to the carcasses while the incinerator/landfill was being prepared.
They were sitting in those roll-offs for 42 days.
Not pleasant.
No.
Made a lot of neighbors happy, I'm sure.
Yeah, they asked for a very large can of Febreze.
Bill Pryor asks if groundwater is contaminated by leachate in and non-farm burial, would it in time decontaminate itself?
And I think the answer is yes.
Probably would.
Natural attenuation does occur. But the length of time it takes and how far the plume would go before that happened would be the concern.
Thank you. Robert Sylvester asks, should staff working in streams and wetland areas be as concerned regarding biosecurity protocols as those employees working directly with farmers or poultry producers? I think that, I guess any of us could answer that, but I think that any time we're going to come in contact with migratory fowl, we've got a chance of picking up the virus and transporting it. So if you're working along a stream or working along a pond, then there's always a chance that you're going to pick up something from the feces of migratory fowl, and so you might want to be concerned with it. Delaney Johnson asks, how readily do animal carcasses break down in landfill systems?
I can take that one. So it depends on how the landfill is managed. If the landfill uses a leachate collection and recirculation system, it would be faster than one that does not. I don't know the exact amount of time for the carcass to break down, but I can tell you that the virus will be inactivated in less than 30 days.
Okay. Kevin Kaija asks, says those ag bags are attractive to bears. Add a fence. That's probably good advice. Fence the bears out. Dave McMillan says, is there any research on pathogen life and movement in burial sites?
Another great question. No. We would like to have some research on pathogen life and movement in burial sites, but we don't have any good data at this time. The data we do have shows that avian influenza virus survives in water at 55 degrees Fahrenheit for more than 30 days. And that is the average groundwater temperature. So just based on temperature, it has the potential to live quite a long time. There have been some studies trying to look at active virus, but there's been reluctance. So we tried to team up with South Korea to study the presence of FMD or not in leachate from their burial sites. And they ultimately were not able to do the study because it would have affected their international trade status. If we had found it, then they could have been prevented from regaining open trade, and that would have been unfair to them because no other country would have that same restriction. So that study was not done in situ. I know there has been work with landfill leachate, and that shows that the viruses in landfill conditions survive less than 30 days.
Okay, good. Chris Carril says, will the attendees of the upcoming compost training be considered subject matter experts after, or will they have to demonstrate their abilities with a response? If they will be considered experts after, how many more composting experts do you expect will be available for response efforts? Thanks.
So I can take that as well. There are 22 slots for the mortality composting class to be held in November. APHIS is paying for that for those 22 people. It turns out that APHIS is only able to pay for APHIS personnel, so the decision was just made that only APHIS personnel will be attending the November class. However, the main compost school who is putting on that class plans to hold an open school, I think in the spring. I would have to double check on that. So there will be an opportunity for non-APHIS folks to take that class. So for the 22 that are going to be trained in November, they're going to be apprentice experts, if you will. They will have to pass a test. They will have to demonstrate they can troubleshoot problems with piles before they get their certificate. They will have to shadow someone during a response. And, you know, as to your last question, will they be considered experts after? As the outbreak gets bigger, the bar for being an expert gets lower. So, you know, it's just the way it is. Yeah, so I think those 22 would be pretty solid. I would prefer if they not go out on their own right away and they do shadow someone, but they may be forced to go out on their own.
Just as long as the experts don't become the guy from out of town with a clipboard.
So, Laurie and Glenn, I have the Maine Compost School flyer for their 2016 dates, and they have June 20 through the 24th, and then October 17th through the 21st.
And so that's their standard compost school, which does not focus on infected mortalities.
Oh, so they're going to have an additional class?
Yes, that's my understanding. I think he said April.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Bill Pryor asked, what percentage of infected farms never returns to production?
Well, yeah, and I don't know the answer to that.
No, I'm not sure there is an answer. I would say that they're probably, particularly with the egg industry, with the egg farms, there may be some that haven't returned to production yet, just because of the fact that there aren't that many pullets ready to go to be put into laying houses. So that might be a problem bringing back the supply of eggs just because of that.
And last status update I saw, we were at about 170 out of 197, and I don't know why that's different than the 211, but so we're getting 80%, maybe 90% of all of the infected farms are eligible to restock. Whether they do or not is an economic decision they will have to make.
Okay. Holly says, stay with us if you can, but if you need to move on and want to earn CEUs, you can return to conservation webinars at this time to complete step 2. Okay. Kevin Kaja says, just a thought, no need to respond. A leach field is just that, a field that leaches. Perhaps one needs to look at plants and fungal plant soil associations above native soil to treat waters impacted by what are considered wastes, unfortunately. Yeah, I think that's right. But it comes down to the fact that it doesn't matter, it doesn't seem to matter how much we know and how much we learn. There's always something more to know and something more to learn. It's just amazing the number of holes there are in research of all sorts.
And I just want to mention that Virginia is working on a study for what they call above ground burial, and it involves planting the surface of the mounds with hydrophilic plants. So that work is going on.
Carl DePolt says, how have these outbreaks affected the price of poultry products? Well, if you've done any shopping, the price of eggs doubled in about a 6-week period earlier this spring, and it's held up there. We were at a meeting last week where one of the egg producers that was impacted in Iowa indicated that if the egg industry was impacted as much this fall as it was this spring, that we'd be looking at $6 a dozen eggs in the grocery stores. So there's been a big impact on prices. Most of the market for turkey is from Minnesota is in fall for Thanksgiving, but I expect that if you can find a cheap turkey and keep it in your freezer at this point in time, you might want to do that for Thanksgiving. Carl DuPolt says migratory fall are a concern for spreading avian influenza. Lots of concerns to consider. Any suggestions? I was flippantly was going to say a 12 gauge, but
well, I have a couple. Yeah, well, so I think the earlier question about should folks who have work in wetlands and near ponds and where waterfowl congregate, should they be taking biosecurity precautions? I think that certainly for if the same gear will be used to go to a domestic, herd to a poultry production facility, I think yes, biosecurity would be very important.
Right, I agree. See, Bob Sylvester says, at what point in late fall or winter can we become less concerned with high path avian influenza until we resume when spring arrives? I would think once it comes, it comes. Flu viruses, influenza viruses are cold-living viruses. That's why we all get the flu in the wintertime. So, if it appears, I would expect that it'll be a problem.
And it's my understanding also that the Atlantic flyways, that we're going to see a lot of migration starting mid-October. We should keep our ears perked up. That's when the birds will start reaching Delmarva and then down into the Carolinas. Last year we didn't see any commercial outbreak until January.
The one thing that I think we were in a meeting a few weeks ago, Lori, somebody from U.S. or from Fish and Wildlife from that agency indicated that one of the things they monitored earlier last spring was the incidence of dead geese, because this particular flu, rather than being harbored by geese, actually killed geese. So when people started asking questions about dead geese, finding dead geese in the area, it became a monitoring thing for the avian influenza. Okay, I think we're done with questions. Holly, what do we do now?
Well, you can wrap up with whatever concluding comments you want to make.
Appreciate everybody's time. I saw at one point in time that we had 476 individuals on the webinar, and I think that's pretty darn good. I'm glad people are this interested and this concerned about the situation. And now, do you do the quiz?
I'll take it from here, Glenn.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. So, yeah, total logins was right around 500, and even right now at the end, we've got about 250, and through the Q&A, somewhere around 350. So, really interested group of participants, and nicely done. So, I want to thank all of you, the participants, and Lori, Cherie, and Glenn for making the presentation. Appreciate your time and effort that goes into a webinar like this.
Well, thanks for organizing it.
No problem. Happy to do it. So for participants, if you're ready to provide your feedback and take your quiz to earn your CEUs, you'll just go back to your Open Conservation browser, openconservationwebinars.net browser window to complete the process that's offered by step 2. And the traffic has probably slowed down a little bit, but if the page is a little bit slow to load, just be patient, because this was a very big webinar today. So with that concludes our webinar presentation today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.